Well, welcome, and thank you then for showing up here and for being with us. My name is Gabe Velez, and I'm at Marquette University. I'm here with a wonderful colleague of mine.
I'm Jean Klosowski-Sack from the University of Illinois, Chicago.
And we're here for our sort of critical conversation, which is got a really super long title, but basically is kind of an overview of restorative justice, some research on it in relation to school settings, some opportunities for further kind of need for research, and then really also to kind of engage in a conversation with you all. So we have some time set aside at the end for that. I sort of already kind of jumped the gun moving forward a little bit, but basically we'll start with a tiny bit more sort of introduction and goals, then an opening activity. So we are going to ask you actually to be on your phone or if your computer's open to just sort of submit one or two things to join in with us. Then we'll do a presentation where we have sort of two parts. One is a summary of the research on restorative justice and practices in schools, and then on areas for expansion. Then we're going to have that time for kind of group discussion. We have a good sized group here, so we're probably going to split it up into maybe 3 or 4 groups, and we'll see. We had an idea of doing it sort of on topical interests. We may just kind of group people more broadly, but so be ready to talk. And then we'll do kind of an ending reflections with an opportunity too for you all to share either questions or areas you'd like more resources on. And then we're going to kind of try and compile those, and anyone can follow up with us, and we'll share that with you all. So with that, sort of as introductions, I already said I'm at Marquette University. My background is as a developmental psychologist. I'm really focused on adolescence and identity formation. I do a lot of work around peace education, restorative justice. Peace education, my dissertation was actually based in Columbia, and that's where I first saw restorative justice kind of in action as part of the peace process there. And then now I've been doing a lot of work with schools in the Milwaukee area around restorative justice interventions, and my research is really interested in trying to understand what that experience means for young people, how they're processing it, making meaning of it, and then how that's sort of shaping their developmental trajectories possibly. I'll let Jean introduce herself, and then we'll talk a little bit about the goals.
Yeah, good afternoon. So I'm Jean again, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Illinois, Chicago. But I really come to this work from a practitioner background. I was a high school teacher and got involved in restorative justice as a teacher, and then moved on to supporting restorative practices at the district level in schools across Chicago. And so I decided to become a graduate student and learn more about this from the research perspective, because I really want to understand, how do we make school discipline something that is a learning opportunity for young people instead of something that pushes them out. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you today to speak to you from both my practitioner lens as well as my researcher lens.
And so with that in mind, our goals are first, as I sort of mentioned, share some summaries of current research and the opportunities for expansion. Then also to sort of share and learn from our varied experiences that we have here. I think folks often come to these kind of conversations about restorative justice with either an interest or some experience and background, and so we're going to kind of try and tap into that. And then hopefully creating some connections and networks too, so that you'll all be talking with each other, you have the opportunity to connect with us, but so that can hopefully carry forth beyond the short 50 minutes that we have together here. So to start, I'm going to pull up a poll that we're going to ask you to answer 2 questions. It's a Mentimeter poll if you've ever done it before. The first is, how would you categorize your experience with or knowledge of restorative justice? Either a spoon, a cup, or a bucket, and that's up to you to decide how you kind of interpret those. And then the second is maybe which of these areas interests you the most in respect to restorative justice in schools. Is it about sort of applied implementation? Is it about valuation, basic research? Is it just generally kind of you want to learn more? Or is it particularly around sort of like an equity lens and how restorative justice can promote equity in these settings? So I will pull up now the Mentimeter. Sorry, it's here. So I know it's a little bit tiny, but if you go to menti.com, so that's MENTI.com, and then the code you need to put in is 9492 7037. It's menti.com, MENTI.com, and then the code is 9492 70-37. And we'll get to kind of get a sense of where everyone is at and entering this conversation. You might even get a nice little like bell curve there, it seems. Great. So I appreciate everyone sharing this, and it just gives all of us, including us up here, sort of a little bit of sense. So it seems like a number of folks feel they're entering the space with not as much experience, some kind of in that middle range, and I would actually honestly put myself there as well, and then some who have a great deal more experience with it. The second question is also kind of to get an informational sort of background, and I think it should come up. I'm sorry if it doesn't, like if you answer the first one, if you have any issue, let me know and I can figure it here. But this is about which of the areas of restorative justice, or which of these areas interest you the most with respect to restorative justice.
It says wait for presenter to show the next slide.
All right, sorry, that's my fault, thank you. I use Menti and I know other folks use, okay, here, Poll Everywhere, but they're a little bit different, sometimes I forget. Great. So if you haven't, continued to do it, it looks like kind of the trend we're seeing emerging is a lot of folks entering the space thinking about equity and an equity lens, and then some another sort of group, particularly with that applied implementation and the learning more. And hopefully we'll all get to learn a little bit together in the space. So that's kind of just an opening to get a sense of where we're all at. I'll hand it off now for our next part, which is kind of trying to do a high-level summary of some of the research to date.
Okay. And this is very high level, and I'm trying to jam a lot in here in just a few minutes. So if you have any questions about anything that you see here, please feel free to bring them up in our discussion later, or feel free to approach me or Gabe after the session. I'm happy to talk more with you about any of this. So for those of you who are less familiar with restorative practices, scholars kind of tend to describe restorative practices as having two elements. So one is the proactive piece of restorative practices, which is about building community and relationships, right? So the way that that's done in a restorative way is with a real focus on having equitable ways of building relationships. So making sure that everyone has an equal voice and feels like they are really being listened to in a space. And a community building circle is a process that's used that allows for that to happen. And then on the responsive end, when harm occurs, usually the restorative justice element comes in there, right? And so the restorative justice approach has, and that philosophy has the idea that justice is achieved when people are in right relationship with each other, right? So instead of focusing on what rules have been broken and what punishments need to be had by the people who broke the rules, the focus is on how are we going to restore and repair these relationships because this harm has occurred. And also, instead of thinking about, or instead of giving the power to decide what's going to happen in response to a harm to an authority, a restorative approach brings in the community, the people who were affected by the harm, in a process to make sure that they are included in making decisions about what needs to happen to move forward. And so this can be done with just a couple of people in a restorative conversation or chat. Usually those are more informal. It can be done in a more structured, larger group process, like a peace circle or restorative conference. And these processes can be facilitated by adults but they can also be facilitated by young people, and lots of schools have peer mediation or peer conference programs where they train leaders to do this work. And so just, wanted to point out just a couple of images here. There's a picture of some young people on a rug in a talking circle together, or a community building circle together. And then the image below that is a picture of my Restorative Questions card that I had when I was working in the school. So the Restorative Questions are typically used in a response to harm process, where you ask questions like, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about since? Who was affected by the harm, right? Or who was affected by what happened? What do you need to do to make things right? And how can we work together to make sure that this doesn't happen again? So it's just important to acknowledge that restorative practices were not developed in schools. They were not developed by scholars or researchers, but these have foundations in indigenous practices from all over the world, including the Maori practices in New Zealand, different indigenous communities in countries across Africa, as well as indigenous communities in North America, and some Christian faith traditions. And so, bringing the best of all of these different traditions and minds from these different communities together, some of these practices made their way into westernized institutions in the 1970s through legal or youth criminal legal systems, and then into the schools in the 1990s, and increasingly into the schools throughout the United States. So the reason for the interest in restorative practices in schools really has its foundations in the rise of zero tolerance and exclusionary approaches to discipline. And from the fact that so many of you are here because of an interest in equity, I'm assuming that you probably are familiar with the school to prison pipeline. But what we're seeing is exponential growth in the use of suspensions and expulsions, and these are disproportionately affecting students who are Black, Latinx, LGBTQ+, and have documented disabilities. And there's just starting to be mountains of research showing all of the negative outcomes that young people experience when they are suspended, and there's just a few of them up on the screen right now. And one of the things that's starting to also become apparent in the research is that you don't even have to be suspended to experience these negative outcomes. You just have to be in the schools where students are being suspended to experience these outcomes, right? So suspension is bad for the students who are being suspended, but it's also bad for the students who are in schools where their peers are being suspended. And so as restorative practices has grown in response to these negative findings about suspension and about expulsion and other exclusionary practices, researchers are trying to see, okay, well, what does restorative practices do? Is it the antidote that we were looking for, right? And so many of those studies are specifically looking at, does it reduce what we know is not working? Does it to get rid of exclusionary discipline in schools? And so across those studies, we are seeing, yes, when restorative practices is implemented in schools, schools are less likely to suspend. Right? They're less likely to remove students from classrooms where this is being implemented. Fewer studies, however, have looked at other factors such as school climate or other outcomes such as school climate or students' SEL skills. But generally, in those studies that are looking at those outcomes, they are seeing positive changes, right? That climate improves, SEL skills improve. There are some more mixed results in the bucket of outcomes that we're looking at on the right. But I just wanted to highlight one of them, which is the disciplinary disproportionality piece. So, one of the things that studies are finding is that in general, disciplinary disproportionality is narrowing in schools that are implementing restorative practices. Some studies have found that this wasn't really impacted at all, or at least not significantly. But even those schools where disciplinary disproportionality is reduced, it's not eliminated. And so scholars and researchers and advocates all over are saying, well, we can implement restorative practices, but we can't do it alone, right? We need to have an equity lens in addition to restorative practices in order for this to really address the issue of disciplinary disproportionality. So another thing that scholars are looking at and researchers are looking at is what do stakeholders think of restorative practices in their schools, right? So in order for these efforts to be sustainable, in order for them to be accepted in the schools, people have to think that they're effective. They have to believe that they're beneficial to them. And so when they ask staff, students, and parents what they think of restorative practices, for the most part, they're seeing the same kinds of benefits that I showed you on the last slide that researchers are seeing, right? The social emotional learning, caring relationships that improve school climate. They're seeing that these effectively address student behavioral issues, and they have now started to look at restorative practices, at least in one study of 5 schools in New York City, as a preferred approach to school discipline and conflict, right? That this is better than other alternatives that they've seen. But these studies have also found that staff, students, and parents see challenges in restorative practices implementation. And that a year or 2 years after implementation has started, they're not necessarily seeing the changes that they had anticipated, right? That some people are kind of stuck, or some schools are kind of stuck in what they were doing before. And it's just, this research is really important for practitioners because it can help practitioners to be able to advocate for restorative practices in their schools, but also to be able to anticipate challenges that they might face in implementation and start thinking, in advance about, okay, well, how are we going to work with teachers, schools, students, and parents who, aren't benefiting from this or don't see it as a benefit. So another area that researchers are looking at is when is restorative practices most effective? And what they're finding is that it's most effective when it's embraced as a way of thinking and being. So you're not just following a script, but you are a restorative person, right? And so you might be doing this outside of school with your families and friends and relatives, as well as just living, being restorative day in and day out in the school, as well as when staff focus on building strong, supportive relationships with students, that's when they see it being most effective. And so adults, recognizing that adults need to think about their own social emotional skills and think about what does it mean to show respect, so also involving cultural competencies, right? Showing that they're really listening to their students is an important element of making restorative practices effective. And in order for all of these things to happen, schools need resources, and they need to have resources not just for a year or 2 years, but for the long haul to make this sustained implementation possible. And of course, if you're familiar with schools at all and interventions in schools, you know that resources such as time and money can be pretty hard to come by, and so that's a real challenge. But also changing mindsets and attitudes that's necessary in order for this to happen. So just lastly, before I turn it back over to Gabe to talk about how we think we might be able to expand on this foundation of work, is just recognizing that a lot of these studies, most of these studies were conducted before the pandemic. And so thinking about what does restorative practices look like in the era of virtual learning and social distancing and recovering from this collective trauma, Gabe actually did some research looking at educators and students and how they adapted restorative practices in the COVID era, and found that they were able to do so, right? That like this is possible in the COVID era. However, students are coming back to school stressed and traumatized, and so they are more likely to show challenging behavior, and educators are coming back to school more stressed and traumatized. And so they might also be more likely to revert to some of, what they were socialized to do when they were younger, be a little bit more punitive. And we're seeing that suspensions are on the rise as students return to school. So just thinking about the challenges of restorative implementation now is definitely something that we hope to be able to discuss with you today.
So we will have an opportunity again to have kind of more of a discussion, but I did want to take a second before we move on to see if there were any questions or responses that anyone wanted to share to that part right now. All right, great. We'll have some time, as I said, for some of that. Some of the kind of room for expansion, and this is not necessarily everywhere that folks could go with this area of research and development, but just some that we've highlighted and found in the work that we're doing. The first is in relation to implementation. So thinking about the diversity of practices and contexts. Restorative practices is very much in tune to the context in which it's happening when it's done well, and when it's not done well, it often is about sort of one-off implementation of just circles or something else. And so when we're talking about like a research base around restorative practices in schools, it's very complicated because it is going to look very different. Even thinking about the sort of equity lens, right? The questions around equity you may be facing in Milwaukee public schools, because of the historical part, the structural, the systemic, is not the same as Denver public schools, is not the same as private schools in New York that may be implementing it, right? And so those things have to be taken in consideration, but there's definitely some ways to expand in terms of the implementation. Think about first, how are these being used in actuality? Sometimes some of the research gets into this, but there's a lot to understand, like, what does this mean in terms of the implementation? So teachers are sent, let's say, to a training. What does that actually then look like on the ground in their classrooms or schools? And then also, what is specifically impactful? So Jean laid out in kind of this array of practices. We can think of circles, conferences. Sometimes these get focused around sort of tiers, so tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. But thinking about what is the stuff that's sort of the essence of it. If we're saying that it has this potential to be impactful, what is it, and what are the practices that are most critical for having that? And there can be more that's sort of dug into in terms of that. A second one is in this part about sort of the relationships between adults and young people. That's relational sort of dynamics are integral to restorative practices, and they're also one of the things, as Jean just highlighted, that's there in the research. But really thinking about this question, not just of the strength of relationships, but sort of the quality and the aspect of kind of respect and equality. What does it mean when restorative practices are done well, and students are in a school where respect and equality is an essential part of their relationships with their educators, versus other ones where it might not be, or other values are prioritized instead. So some ways there to kind of think of the expansion. One is about the social implications, right? For their relationships with their peers, for who they are outside of the school context, right? When those kind of formative relationships with adults in the school setting are ones that are based in respect and equality in a restorative way, what kind of implications do those have more broadly socially? And then this question of kind of social justice in schooling. There is some great work that engages some of these questions. There's one book in particular, Justice on Both Sides, which I'd really recommend if you're kind of interested in the equity and the social justice, but it rooting in that part of the relationship building. So not just are there stronger relationships, what is the school climate like in terms of relationships, but actually this particular question about social justice. And this quote actually comes from Justice on Both Sides to kind of give you an example of what this might be, this kind of impact, and we can delve into it. And in this quote, this young person is describing their experience, and they said, with restorative practices, it's like when you come into a restorative justice circle, everybody kind of has equal ground. The teacher is not looked at as a teacher, and the student is not looked at as a student. Everyone needs to be respected, and everybody needs to have that equality. And in some ways, I mean, that's a deep and sort of seismic shift from the traditional teacher-student relationship. And so I think that can be kind of explored more, what it means for these young people to experience that. The next one, and this is really my sort of central area of interest, is in the developmental impacts. So as Jean noted, a lot of the research focuses on kind of the school environment or the behavioral or disciplinary elements. I'm really curious about what does it mean for you as you grow into an adult to have come from a school environment where this was what was your experience. And so sort of beyond the kind of harm focus, how does that maybe shape the ways that you relate to other people, the ways that you become and think of yourself as a member of a different society, a different community? And so in particular, I think there can be kind of a greater sort of depth and exploration between the restorative justice in a school context and questions of civic engagement are also critical consciousness. And maybe even more explicitly too, even in the implementation part and the actual use of it. And then my kind of personal interest is sort of identity-based, thinking about personal and civic identity, thinking about self-efficacy, right, the messages that young people might be internalizing or how they're responding to these experiences. And then lastly, and I think it's connected here too, is a deeper integration with social-emotional learning and skills development. I think there's a real wealth of opportunity to, both theoretically and empirically, kind of delve more into how restorative justice may offer not just a response to behavioral inequities, but also inequities in how we evaluate, how we think about, how we educate around social-emotional learning. And then lastly, this doesn't all involve like reinventing the wheel. And I work with some colleagues who are moral developmental psychologists, and they're really excited and trying to make a lot of connections to say, hey, we have this wealth of understanding of moral development, and let's think about how restorative justice might connect there with that. Let's bring some of the things we already know to this work to strengthen its implementation, to strengthen our understanding of its impact. And then kind of lastly, one thing on just sort of on the back burner, this is more sort of musing in my head in some ways, or in both of our heads, because we were part of kind of a thinking group about this. One is that these students, right, when we're talking about this equity lens in particular, these students are not only suffering, let's say, disciplinary practice, or sort of this disciplinary disproportionality in their schools, but often they're also part of groups that are marginalized or even pathologized beyond the school context, right? And so they're sort of getting it doubly. They're getting it in the societal discourse and maybe out in the broader society, and then they're getting it in the school as well. And so really getting into a deeper exploration then of the student experience and meaning making of restorative practices, but kind of from this ecological focus. Because the way I think of it is sort of, okay, so let's even say restorative justice in the school context promotes a greater sense of equity, and you lower the disciplinary discrepancies, and you make it more about respect and equality. What does it mean then for a student maybe stepping out into the world where they're still facing that from other people in their society, from the police in their community, from the discourses they're seeing in the media, right? And so how are they kind of making sense of that, even if the school is, let's say, perfectly implementing and doing all these things that we're maybe hoping for restorative practices? And I think about that in relation to another quote. I really love this book, Justice on Both Sides, if you haven't noticed. But from one student who talks about this, like, everyone is seen, everyone is heard. And, like, what does that mean when you feel that in your school, but maybe you're not feeling that beyond your school, right? And, like, how do young people then kind of make sense out of that? And that's some of where my kind of interest lies in some of the research that I'm doing.